At 9:15 in the morning, a young lieutenant lay motionless inside the shattered remains of a Japanese bunker, staring through the scope of a rifle. Almost everyone in his battalion had mocked. For 6 weeks they had called it a toy, a hunting rifle, a mail order, sweetheart, the wrong weapon for the jungle. But now 14 Americans were dead, picked off one by invisible Japanese snipers hiding high in the banyan trees around Point Cruz. Patrols searched the forest and found nothing. Every trail had become a death sentence. The jokes had stopped. The battalion commander had only one question left. Could that ridiculous civilian rifle do what an entire battalion could not? Second Lieutenant John George didn't answer with confidence. He answered with preparation. Long before Guadalcanal, before the Pacific War reached its most desperate months, George had been obsessed with precision. While other National Guardsmen spent their weekends drilling, he spent every spare dollar chasing perfection at the rifle range. At 23, he became the youngest Illinois state rifle champion, placing perfect groups at distances most shooters considered impossible. The trophies impressed fellow marksmen. The Army barely noticed, but George noticed something else. Military rifles were built for volume. He believed some battles would be won by a single carefully placed shot. That belief cost him nearly 2 years of National Guard pay. He ordered a Winchester model Fay-chambered for the same Fay-caliber cartridge used by Army rifles, mounting a Lyman Alaskan scope on top. It wasn't military issue. It wasn't even designed for combat. It arrived halfway around the world after he did. When the wooden crate finally reached Guadalcanal, Captain Morris looked at the polished hunting rifle and shook his head. Carry a real weapon. George carried the Winchester anyway. The teasing followed him everywhere. Some laughed because it looked expensive. Others laughed because it looked fragile. No one believed a bolt-action hunting rifle belonged in modern war. George never argued every evening. While other officers played cards or wrote letters home, he quietly cleaned the Winchester. He behaved as though he already knew the argument would eventually settle itself. For weeks, it didn't. The battle for Mount Austin consumed the regiment. 47 Japanese bunkers carved into rocky hillsides demanded grenades, flamethrowers, and relentless infantry assaults. George fought alongside everyone else, but his prized rifle remained silent. The critics had their proof. The toy had accomplished nothing. Then the battlefield changed. West of the Matanikau River, towering banyan trees replaced concrete bunkers. Japanese survivors abandoned fixed defenses and disappeared into the canopy, climbing 90 feet above the jungle floor before sunrise. They became ghosts. American soldiers filled canteens. One fell patrols crossed open trails. Another collapsed. A man would glance upward only after hearing the rifle crack, discovering nothing except endless branches. 14 Americans died in 72 hours. No sniper was found. The commander summoned George after dark. The room was quiet. This wasn't about theories anymore. The battalion needed results. George simply listed facts. State rifle champion. Years of long-range competition. Groups measured in inches where others measured in feet. Then he made a promise. Give him until morning. That night, he stripped the Winchester completely apart. Every screw, every scope mount, every moving surface, still coated with traces of cosmoline from its long ocean voyage. He selected each cartridge individually, rejecting any round that looked imperfect under lantern light. He wasn't preparing for battle. He was preparing for an examination. Only failure meant more funerals. Before dawn, George crawled alone into the ruins of a captured Japanese bunker overlooking the coconut groves near Point Cruz. No radio, no spotter, no assistant, only 60 rounds, a canteen, and patience. Hours passed. The jungle refused to move. Birds landed. Insects crawled across his hands. Sweat soaked his uniform. Still he waited. The Lyman scope offered only modest magnification, but George wasn't searching for faces. He was searching for mistakes. At exactly Fay, one appeared. A single branch shifted. No breeze disturbed the rest of the canopy. George didn't fire. He watched. The branch moved again. Now he saw it. A Japanese sniper wedged between 3 limbs, perfectly concealed, except for one tiny movement. George slowed his breathing, adjusted for wind, squeezed. The crack echoed through the trees. The sniper tumbled nearly 90 feet before striking the ground. George immediately worked the bolt, because experienced snipers rarely hunted alone. Instead of celebrating, he searched for the second man 26 minutes later. He found him climbing down another tree after hearing the first shot. The Japanese soldier believed he was escaping. George fired once. The body crashed through the branches. 2 shots, 2 kills. He reloaded calmly. Then everything changed. A bullet slammed into the sandbags inches from his face. Someone else had found him. George flattened himself against the bunker wall, resisting every instinct to peek immediately over the edge. The sniper who fired already knew exactly where George had been. Looking too quickly meant dying exactly where the enemy expected. So he waited. 3 long minutes. Only then did he begin searching again. Not where the shot originated. Where, same tree, different branch. A tiny mistake. George ended it with 1 shot. 3 snipers dead before noon. None of the victories brought satisfaction. Each success only confirmed something worse. The Japanese were adapting. By afternoon, the trees became perfectly still. No movement, no opportunities. Someone on the other side had realized another hunter had entered the jungle. When George returned to camp that evening, Captain Morris no longer joked about the Winchester. He simply told him to return before sunrise. Rain swallowed the jungle the next morning. Visibility disappeared behind gray curtains of water. George waited. Patience had become his greatest weapon. When the storm finally eased, he spotted another sniper nearly 300 yards away, farther than the Japanese had dared position themselves before. They had learned his effective range, or thought they had. George compensated carefully and fired. The sniper collapsed. Seconds later, mortar shells began walking toward his bunker. The Japanese weren't reacting randomly anymore. They had located his firing position. George abandoned the bunker just before artillery reduced it to splintered timber and smoking earth. If he'd hesitated 30 seconds longer, there would have been nothing left to recover. He relocated behind a fallen tree, started over. The mission hadn't changed. Only the danger had, that afternoon, brought 2 more kills. Each sniper concealed himself differently. Higher, farther. Patient enough to remain motionless for hours. George realized he wasn't simply removing enemy shooters anymore. He was fighting professionals who studied every mistake made by the man before them. The jungle had become a classroom where failure meant death. By nightfall, 8 snipers were dead. 3 remained. George understood exactly what that meant. The weakest were already gone. The survivors had watched every lesson unfold. He barely slept, not because of fear, because he couldn't stop thinking like the men still hunting him. Before dawn on the 3rd morning, George made the most important decision of the operation. He abandoned every successful firing position. The Japanese expected him to return. He refused to give them that certainty. Instead, he crawled into an abandoned marine machine. Gun position among weathered rocks overlooking the groves. The first sniper appeared shortly after sunrise. Low in a palm tree, perfectly exposed, perfectly obvious. George settled behind the scope, then stopped. Nothing about it felt right. 8 experienced snipers had already died. The 9th wouldn't suddenly become careless. If the target looked easy, perhaps the target wasn't the real target. George lowered the rifle. Instead of firing, he searched every surrounding tree. 11 long minutes passed. Then he found him. Hidden almost 100 feet above the ground, another sniper watched the palm tree, not the battlefield. He was watching. The exposed soldier had been bait. George now faced an impossible choice. Shoot the hidden sniper first, and the decoy might escape. Shoot the decoy first, and the hidden sniper would immediately know his position. He chose something different. George fired at the bait, exactly as the hidden sniper expected. The instant the decoy fell, the concealed shooter instinctively turned toward the sound. That tiny movement exposed him. George was already there. Second shot, second body. The trap had failed, but success lasted only seconds. Machine gun fire exploded across the rocks he had just occupied. Stones shattered into dust. George was already gone. He had moved immediately after firing, diving into a flooded shell crater, while bullets ripped apart the position he had abandoned. Now the hunt belonged equally to both sides. 10 snipers were dead. 1 remained. George no longer assumed the last man waited in a tree. That assumption almost killed him. Movement caught his eye through dense undergrowth, not above below. The final sniper was crawling through the jungle floor toward George's previous position, patient. Silent, thinking exactly as George himself would think. George couldn't fire. The crater rim blocked his angle, so he waited. Minute after minute, the Japanese sniper crawled closer, finally climbing into the abandoned machine gun nest George had left earlier. His back was fully exposed. The shot seemed effortless. George refused it. Nobody who survived this long made mistakes that simple. He widened his search again. Another shape, another rifle. A second Japanese soldier hidden behind a fallen log, covering the machine gun position. They had built a crossfire. George smiled to himself. The battlefield had become a contest between 2 men who trusted suspicion more than opportunity. He lowered himself deeper into muddy water until only his eyes remained above the surface. The Winchester rested upright beside him. 10 minutes later, convinced their trap had failed, both Japanese soldiers stood and began advancing. Side by side, backs exposed. Now the trap belonged to George. He rose silently. 1 shot, bolt, second shot. Both soldiers collapsed before either understood what had happened. 11 enemy snipers had been eliminated in 4 days. George allowed himself 1 brief breath. Then he heard voices. More than one. A recovery party. They weren't searching randomly. They followed boot prints through the mud. Straight toward his crater, 5 rounds remained. At least 6 Japanese soldiers approached. This wasn't marksmanship anymore. It was survival. George had 2 choices. Run now and expose himself, or remain hidden until someone looked directly into the crater. He stayed. Seconds later, a Japanese soldier peered over the rim. Their eyes met. George fired upward. The man fell backward. 2 more appeared immediately behind him. George cycled the bolt, almost by instinct. Another shot. Then, another. 3 attackers fell before they fully understood where the fire had come from. Only 2 cartridges remained. George climbed from the opposite side of the crater and sprinted into the jungle. Bullets shredded leaves around him. Branches whipped across his face. He reached another fallen tree, turned briefly, and fired once more at an advancing soldier. The man dropped. The rest scattered for cover. Now George faced reality. 1 round remained. Too many enemies. Too little ammunition. Every instinct trained into a rifle champion demanded careful engagement. Every instinct learned in combat demanded something harder. Leave, George turned and ran. Not because he had lost, because surviving mattered more than finishing. 90 exhausting seconds later, he reached another shell crater and listened. The voices faded. The pursuit stopped. The Japanese chose to recover their dead rather than continue chasing a disappearing ghost through unfamiliar jungle. George finally checked the Winchester. Mud coated the action. Water dripped from the barrel. 1 cartridge remained. He walked carefully back toward American lines, reaching them just after 11 o'clock. Captain Morris listened without interrupting. 11 confirmed sniper kills. Only a handful of carefully placed shots. An entire campaign of terror ended. The officer who had once dismissed the Winchester as a toy asked a different question now. Could George teach others to do the same? That question mattered more than every shot fired in the jungle. George accepted on one condition. He kept his own rifle. Within days, expert marksmen were assembled. Springfield rifles with scopes emerged from storage. George taught breathing before shooting, observation before movement, patience before courage. He insisted the rifle wasn't the weapon. The decision was. Every trigger pull had already been won or lost minutes earlier. The newly formed sniper teams entered the jungle before the Japanese evacuation of Guadalcanal. Their results were immediate. American casualties dropped. Japanese positions that once felt untouchable became vulnerable. The battlefield hadn't changed. American thinking had. George himself was later wounded in Burma while serving with Merrill's Marauders, where the Winchester claimed only 3 more carefully chosen targets during months of brutal jungle warfare. After the war, he returned home, studied at Princeton and Oxford, and eventually devoted his life to public service rather than military fame. He rarely spoke about Point Cruz. Instead, he wrote a remarkably practical book, Fay Shots Fired in Anger, Fay Recording Lessons, exactly as he had learned them with precision instead of glory. His rifle eventually found its way into a museum display. Visitors often pass by without slowing. It looks ordinary. Just another hunting rifle behind glass. Nothing about polished walnut and blued steel suggests 4 desperate days on Guadalcanal. Nothing reveals the weeks of ridicule that came before, or the 14 American funerals that forced one commander to reconsider a joke. History remembers battles because they reshape maps. But maps changed at Point Cruz only after one young lieutenant refused to leave a rifle behind, simply because everyone else believed it didn't belong. The victory began long before the first sniper fell. It began with a decision no one thought mattered, one man choosing to trust his judgment over the certainty of everyone around him.